I've always been fascinated by supernovas and by the variety of supernovas that there are in our universe. Today we're going to talk about two major types of supernovas and how they're different and what makes them so special. Welcome to What the Math and enjoy the video. And first, let's just start by looking at different simulations we have for different supernova in this game. There's actually only 4 available to us, and there's one called Supernova Close-Up in real time, and there's another one called Supernova Type 1A. We're actually going to take a look at this one in a second. But here, basically, let me just define what a supernova is. Essentially, if you've never seen it or have heard of supernova before, it is when something happens to a star and it essentially explodes, releasing a huge amount of stuff into the universe. This happens quite frequently, and even in our lifetime, we have detected supernova from other galaxies. But in our own galaxy, the last major supernova occurred about 1,000 years ago, and it was actually widely reported in various books and various chronicles. So these events do happen, and we might even see one in our lifetime, because technically, statistically speaking, there should be one happening in the next few hundreds of years, so we might be able to see one if we're still alive. Now, so there's actually 2 major types of supernova, and they are quite different in the way that they're created and in what essentially they release after the star explodes. And these 2 types are defined as Type 1 and Type 2. Pretty simple. We only have Type 1A in here, and this is actually the one that is probably one of the more important types of supernova for the reasons that I'm going to explain to you in a second. So, Type 1A occurs when a white dwarf, like for example Sirius B, this is probably one of the more famous white dwarfs close to us, close to our solar system, acquire just enough mass to reach what's called a Chandrasekhar limit. I've actually talked about this concept previously, and you can check out the video about it in the link you see right here. And this particular limit essentially is always the same. It's 1.44 of solar masses. So right now we are at 1.27 solar masses, and as soon as this particular star, known as Sirius B, as soon as this white dwarf reaches 144, it is going to initiate a Type 1A supernova. And Chandrasekhar limit is actually one of the more well-studied sort of mathematical concepts in astronomy. And because it's always 1.44, here it is. This is Type 1A supernova. Because it's essentially 1.44, we can use this as a standard to measure various things in our universe. So this type of a supernova, specifically Type 1A supernova, is actually used to measure distances, especially far away distances. So if we were to zoom out really far away, and if we're basically looking at another galaxy and we want to know how far away this galaxy is, and we suddenly see a Type 1A supernova in it, and here it comes. So we actually see this in real time. We see the flash, we see it getting brighter, and then suddenly stopping getting brighter, and then we basically see the limit of brightness. Because we actually know what this brightness usually is, depending on what we actually see in this other galaxy, we can actually compare it to our current knowledge of Type 1A supernovas, and then estimate the distance to that particular galaxy. And this is actually how many galaxies that are really far away from us, like for example, anywhere from about 1 million to several million light years away from us, we would usually use Type 1A supernova in those galaxies to try to estimate the distance, because it's actually very accurate. And all of the Type 1A supernova are basically called Type 1 for a simple reason, because of the type of light that they emit. Specifically here, we're talking about none of these having any hydrogen lines in their light spectra. In other words, when Type 1 supernova goes supernova, when the star goes supernova, and it's Type 1A, it will not actually have any hydrogen present, or almost no hydrogen present in here, because as you may have watched in one of the previous videos, white dwarfs are essentially just empty shells that no longer have any hydrogen in them. So essentially this is a combination of carbon and oxygen, but all of the hydrogen has pretty much disappeared and has gone into the outer solar system. And so when it does go supernova, it creates other lines in the spectra, but not hydrogen. And so this is why all of these are called type 1a, and because they're all of them are essentially formed from white dwarfs that have reached their Chandrasekhar limit from one reason or another. They are essentially all similar and have very, very similar parameters. But there are actually also type 1b and type 1c supernova. These are a little bit more complex and essentially are called type 1b if they have also helium lines present, not just carbon and oxygen and not just a lack of hydrogen, but they also have helium. And type 1c is if they actually have no helium but some other lines. And we'll talk more about this in detail in some future videos because it does get a little bit more complex. But the idea here is that most of the type 1 supernova are essentially formed when a white dwarf, which is the remainder of a star, of a main sequence star, like for example a sun, our sun will become a white dwarf at some point. So when a white dwarf reaches its 1.44 solar mass limit, it essentially explodes. Now, how does this happen? Well, I've talked about this previously as well, but I'm going to quickly recreate this by using a new simulation here. We're going to once again play Series B here, and just for fun, let's place another bigger companion star, or actually let's just place our own sun here. So here is an example of a binary system. This is a Series B, and it's obviously very small because it's a white dwarf. It's essentially condensed in a very tiny amount of space, and the sun. Now technically they're supposed to be orbiting around one another. I'm going to do this by using the binary setting right here, and so here they are orbiting around one another. But with time, if these two stars were orbiting one another, Series B, especially if it's a little bit more massive, or if it's really, really close to the sun, because it's a lot more dense, it would start sucking out some of the materials from the sun into itself and slowly acquiring the sun's mass. And as this mass increases, with time, it would reach the Chandrasekhar limit again, and would essentially go supernova. So this is how type 1a usually occurs, and it's for one reason or another. Usually it's a binary system, sometimes it's some other mass from somewhere else, but this is the idea here. Now, what is type 2 then? And to demonstrate what type 2 is, I'm going to take the largest, the most massive star we've found so far. This is in a nearby galaxy, and I'm going to show you what the type 2 is. So this is a star called R136A1. It's 260 masses of sun. It's absolutely massive. If I were to place sun next to it, you would see how tiny our sun is in a second. There it is. There's our sun. Very, very small. And so here we have this massive star, and as it lives out its life, at some point it is going to become unstable, collapse on itself, start imploding, and then explode. Now this is what would produce either a neutron star or a black hole at the end, but because every massive star goes through this kind of experience, it basically gets really, really massive, and then at some point, if I were to make this realistic, it's at some point is going to essentially explode. Because it reaches a point where essentially there is no more material being produced, nothing to keep the star from collapsing on itself, and as soon as it starts collapsing, it essentially reaches a stage where there's so much energy created that it just explodes into this massive type 2 supernova. Now because this was a star that was very massive and also had various materials on the inside, this will have a lot of hydrogen coming out of it, and so this star will have hydrogen lines. And because it has hydrogen lines, this is why we call this a type 2. And so the main principle here is that all type 2 supernova will have hydrogen coming out of them, and all type 1 supernova will not have any hydrogen. And what's left here, I think, is actually a black hole. Is this a black hole? It looks like a black hole, so it must be a black hole. And what's really interesting is that there are actually no type 2 supernova that have been still found in any of the elliptical types of galaxies. So these do happen in, like for example, in our galaxy or in Andromeda galaxy, so what we would call a spiral galaxy, but it would not happen in elliptical galaxies for one reason or another. We're still not sure why, but we haven't really seen these happen in certain types of galaxies. Whereas Type 1a supernova that you saw previously happens pretty much everywhere. And so even though there is sort of a difference in terms of what's being released from these supernovas, so Type 1 being no hydrogen and Type 2 being a lot of hydrogen, there's also another really important difference between them. So this would be a lot more energetic and have a lot more power and a lot more brightness than Type 1a. It's also, this particular supernova, Type 2 supernova, is super important for essentially creating new stars and new planets, because if or when R136A1 goes supernova, it will actually create what would be later called a star nursery, where new stars will then condense into new solar systems and will create other solar systems and will essentially become new systems with planets and so on around them. Because as the supernova happens, a lot of the new material is being created, and a lot of the heavier material, like for example things like lead, things like uranium, is actually being created through this massive energetic event. And so the reason why you and I are here is actually because a long time ago, billions of years ago, there was a Type 2 supernova somewhere in the vicinity of our solar system that then created all of the material we have inside our bodies, and of course also created our sun and our planet Earth as a result. But as I mentioned, Type 2 supernova don't happen everywhere and are a lot more rare than Type 1 supernova, so if we do see one, it's going to be a very rare event. However, if it does happen, it would be a very bright event that you'll be able to see from pretty much everywhere. Here's another supernova inside a galaxy, and this one is actually also Type 1. But if it does happen, you would be able to pretty much see it in the sky, and it would be brighter than most of the galaxies that we see today, even if it's actually really far away from us. Now, before I finish this video, I just wanted to quickly mention that there is also something called Type 1b and Type 1c supernova, and these are also a little bit different from Type 1a or from Type 2. And the main difference between a Type 1a, which is a supernova based on a white dwarf, and Type 1b or Type 1c supernova is that Type 1a is always from a white dwarf, but Type 1b and Type 1c is very likely associated with short-lived massive stars, and so they are quite different. The main similarity, of course, is that none of them have hydrogen, and so a Type 1b, for example, would actually have helium in it. And so let me just try to simulate this by placing a very large star right here, and we're going to go into materials, and essentially if you were to remove all of this hydrogen and instead have helium in here, I'll just turn it into organics. It's going to be a green star. Essentially, if this is all helium, and the star then goes supernova, this would be a Type 1b supernova. Now, we're not exactly clear on what exactly make this occur, but it's very likely that it's because there are these really unstable, really massive stars that burn through their hydrogen really quickly and have no hydrogen left, and then when there's only helium left, that's when they go supernova. Now, these would be very similar to Type 2, I guess, but the only difference is that they would not have any hydrogen. And Type 1c is also very similar, but it has no helium and no hydrogen, but some other things in it. And those types of supernova are even sort of more rare and more unexplained to us right now. But the main difference essentially between Type 1 and Type 2 is that Type 1 will not have any hydrogen in it, Type 2 will always have hydrogen in it, and Type 2 is a lot more important for the creation of various stars and planets in our solar system or in our universe, whereas Type 1 is essentially a little white dwarf star that gets just enough mass to go boom and disappear from existence forever. And I guess one of the other main differences is that if a Type 1 supernova occurs, so if I were to put Sirius here again and then increase its mass until it goes supernova, you would notice that it would disappear completely. So there's really nothing left here. So once Chandrasekhar limit is reached, the entire star goes supernova, nothing left at the end. However, a Type 2 supernova, so here's R136A1 again, a Type 2 supernova is going to leave a remnant. And this remnant can be either a neutron star or a black hole like the one you see on the screen. So that's another major difference, and I think this is actually something that makes these two really unique. So when you think about it, all of the black holes we have in our galaxy, in our universe, were at some point supernova as well, and have actually created these massive, beautiful clouds that then created new stars, new planets, and continue the cycle of creation of everything in our universe.